Good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to welcome you to the Essentials of Reproductive Justice Access, Autonomy, Action on behalf of the Inamori International Center for Ethics and Excellence, the Flora Stone Mather Center for Women, the Baker Nord Center for the Humanities, and all of the other CWRU students, staff, and faculty who contributed to make today's conversations, learning, and resources possible. This event has been specifically created for the CWRU campus community to offer a basic understanding of what reproductive justice is and all the ways in which reproductive rights and reproductive health can be affected by social injustice. My name is Faith Sanchez, and I am a fourth-year student who will be graduating this May with my master's degree in military ethics and my bachelor's degree in Spanish and political science. I am proud to serve as the president of FIMU and a student associate at the Inamori Center. I am also a first-generation college student and a Latinx woman living in a country with a system that was not made for me. I've done my best to try to adjust it and make it work for me to the best of my ability. Yet on June 24th, 2022, it became apparent there was no way I could keep attempting to fit into this mold. Instead, it was time to break it and do without it. I'm so proud and lucky to belong to this community, and I'd like to express gratitude for all the amazing people who have made today possible. The people that have worked on the project approach the topic with such curiosity, intentionality, and passion. I'm honored to know them and work with them. It is through these collaborations that I learned about Sister Song and the efforts that women of color have made for not only reproductive rights and social justice, but reproductive justice, the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, have children, not have children, and parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. I am now extremely excited to introduce our first speaker of the day, Lori Rodriquez, Education and Advocacy Coordinator for Sister Song. Lori, whose pronouns are she, they, is a queer writer, educator, and content creator of the Indigenous Central American descent. They have worked at the intersection of political organizing, education, art, and media. She has done LGBTQ organizing at the state level and has worked in the abortion movement at local, statewide, and national levels. And she is now the education coordinator of Sister Song, the national women of color-led reproductive justice collective. She also does content creation for the Leslie Lohan Museum of Art, the only contemporary art museum in the world dedicated to LGBTQIA+ art and artists. Their written work, largely art and movie reviews and analysis, along with some poetry, have been published by various small presses. Lori used to work as a bike mechanic, is now an avid motorcyclist and beginner sailor. Before we begin, we would also want to encourage you to all reflect on the history of the land from which you are watching this event. We acknowledge that the land we stand on and the place that we call Cuyahoga County is land that was claimed by the United States government through forced displacement, and treaties negotiated in bad faith. We acknowledge members of the Shawnee, Miami, Erie, Ottawa, Potawatomi, and Haudenosaunee Confederacy, whose lands we stand on, and the thousands of Native Americans representing over 100 tribes who currently live in Northeast Ohio today. Now please join me in welcoming Lori Rodriquez from Sister Song.
Thank you all for having me here today and for inviting me to speak. It is a huge honor to be here in front of you today. And I feel a lot of gratitude for the way y'all have trusted me to ground this space in history and thought and intentions. The land acknowledgement that was just done was absolutely beautiful. It was more thorough than my cursory research was able to lead me. So I just want to reaffirm that we are on unceded Indigenous land. And I also want to acknowledge that the country we are in was built by the stolen, erased, and co-opted labor of Black people, labor of the descendants of people indigenous to the African continent who were stolen from their lands and who are still targeted and persecuted by the culture and institutions of white supremacy. So y'all are here to learn and to hear from me what reproductive justice is. Reproductive justice is a formal framework that has been elaborated on by many thinkers and writers, and it's also a movement, a living, breathing, evolving network of people resisting the domination and control of white supremacy and building a world where oppression is met head-on, where care, real care, takes precedent. The formal reproductive justice movement came out of a very specific moment. In 1994, at a conference in Chicago sponsored by the Illinois Pro-Choice Alliance and the Miss Foundation for Women, a group of community leaders gathered to hear the Clinton administration's proposal for healthcare reform, which sought to de-emphasize reproductive health care, which had been and continues to be reduced to abortion rights, so as to not incur Republican criticism. There were 12 Black women in the room at this conference, and they noticed that the proposed healthcare reforms had little focus on health services such as pre- and postnatal care, fibroid screenings, or STI tests, and that the reforms failed to understand how a person's choices around parenting and reproductive care can be constrained by things such as income, housing, the criminal justice system, and stigma. Whole communities were being thrown under the bus for the sake of optics and politics. So these 12 Black women gathered in a room to talk about it, and they created a group called Women of African Descent for Reproductive Justice. One of the first things this group did was unite to say something. They bought a full-page ad in the Washington Post calling out the Clinton administration. I'll show it to you now. The image is a bit fuzzy. I got this from the Washington Post. But what they did is they made their critiques clear. They also advocated for what they needed. And then they got their friends and supporters to sign on. And then they put it somewhere where people would read it, people would see it, and people would reflect on it. And that was the first action that this group of Black women did to, try to advance reproductive justice. And they didn't stop there. In 1997, because they kept these conversations going after 94, they kept these conversations going. And in 1997, 16 organizations representing and led by Indigenous, Asian Pacific Islander, Black, and Latinx women, including women who had been involved in the Women of African Descent for Reproductive Justice group, came together to form the Sister Song Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective in order to create a national movement for reproductive justice. And that was the beginning of the formal reproductive justice movement, a group of Black, Indigenous, and women of color, a group of community leaders and experts uniting to support and amplify each other in taking care of their communities. They continued meeting and talking about how their communities were being underserved. And as organizers, they continued to ask themselves, how do we build the people power to make sure our communities, which have been ignored, maligned, and treated as disposable, are at the center of these conversations rather than at the margins? I say formal reproductive justice movement because even though this movement coalesced around this moment, reproductive justice, the practice of centering the marginalized, of caring for people's real needs and resisting oppression, genocide, and erasure, is something that Black and Indigenous people have always done. Like we're talking about Sojourner Truth here, resisting the slave trade. That is reproductive justice. Sister Song knew that the best way to create change is to bring people along. So in 2003, they had their first conference where they debuted the term reproductive justice and unveiled the guiding framework to other organizers, leaders, and advocates working for their communities. We spoke about the framework earlier, and I love seeing that it's everywhere on campus right now. I love seeing that repetition and that amplification, but I'll bring it up again. Reproductive justice is the right to decide if and when someone will have a child and the conditions under which they will give birth. It's the right to decide if they will not have a child and their options for preventing or ending pregnancy. It's the right to parent the children they already have with the necessary social supports in safe environments and healthy communities and without fear of violence from individuals or the state. And finally, this can be summed up in the final point, which is one that was actually added recently. That's a cool thing about reproductive justice. It's a growing movement. It's evolving. It's living. It's happening right now. And the final point that was added, or the final tenet that was added recently, was bodily autonomy free from all forms of reproductive oppression. And I think that sums up just the RJ lens really, really well. I want to focus in on the third tenet because it points to the realities that marginalized communities face in the United States. It's one where their health and well-being is sacrificed for the maintenance of white supremacy. I'm talking about Indigenous people being violently forced off their land so that settlers could create societies where they frame themselves as victims and heroes rather than as unwelcome intruders and thieves. I'm talking about a society that constantly tries to erase the history and the continued legacy of the horrors of slavery, where surveillance and policing and prison are treated as normal and necessary rather than as the insidious continuations of a slave-holding society that they are. I'm talking about a society where the sexual revolution and the liberation of women brought on by birth control pills was only possible because Puerto Rican women were intentionally sought out and used as guinea pigs, because the ethics standards that applied to medicine in the mainland were not enforced in the colony. There are so many people who, despite the language enshrined in the Constitution about fairness and equality, are not treated with either, and are targeted and exploited because of their supposed failures to meet these standards of humanity, standards that center a white supremacist understanding of human and attempt to erase the intense violence that this country was built on. We see this legacy of erasure and exploitation and harm continue in the medical system today. One of the ways it manifests is in the maternal mortality crisis. The United States has the highest rates of maternal mortality in the industrialized world. Women are twice as likely to die from complications of pregnancy or childbirth in the US than in Canada or in the United Kingdom. And Black women are 3 times more likely to die from a pregnancy than white women. This isn't an accident. The US as a whole makes it incredibly difficult to access healthcare. Black women in particular are up against a system where, because of internalized bias, doctors believe they feel less pain and dismiss and minimize them. And this racial bias is true regardless of the income a Black woman may have. Do we remember Serena Williams' pregnancy? In an essay in Vogue, Williams detailed how she realized something was wrong soon after giving birth to her daughter, Olympia. Her legs were numb, she said, and eventually she found herself in excruciating pain and realized she couldn't move her legs and back. No one was really listening to what I was saying, she wrote. Serena Williams is a celebrity, someone who can afford the best hospitals, the best doctors, who's on the cover of magazines, and despite this, she still found herself unlistened to, her pain minimized and dismissed. If this is the reality that she faces, what kinds of treatment can an average Black woman expect from the system? This racism, this erasure, is something that has to be discussed openly and confronted head-on to be dealt with. It requires policy changes, it requires systemic changes, but it also requires direct work by people who are in these systems to dismantle and confront the ambient racism that we as individuals are socialized into living in this country, to cultivate and create cultures that actively combat these erasures. Let's get back to the third tenet of RJ, which also gets at the core practices of one of the core practices of reproductive justice, the practice of intersectionality. Coined by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, intersectionality is a framework that foregrounds interdependence, connection, and the compounding effects of oppression. What I mean by this is that often social problems in the United States are discussed and tangled as single issue struggles: race, gender, sexuality, class, disability. In reality, people can occupy many of these categories at once, and the complexity and the reality of their needs and lives can only be understood by looking at their whole of their lives and their contexts. Intersectionality reminds us to look at people as their lived realities and to not reduce them to categories. It also compels us to consider not only the ways that we are harmed by oppression, but also the ways in which we benefit. And I think personally, the ways that we can use those privileges, those benefits to help others. A personal example, I'm Latinx, which is a term that I don't particularly like for a whole host of reasons that I could get into during another talk. But it's a term that gets used for me nonetheless. The most marginalized members of this identity group don't have documentation or legal status in this country, which is something that can easily be erased in discussions of Latinidad. Intersectionality asks me, as a person with citizenship status, to look at my Latinidad and to remember and center those who don't have the privileges that I do. It's something that guides my activist work and that asks me to take the time to listen to people, histories, communities, and stories, and to look beyond the two-dimensional narratives we're fed by pundits. My parents both migrated to this country as illegal immigrants. What this narrative erases is the fact that the United States started civil wars in both of their countries to extract resources and labors, and that my parents were running away from the instability and chaos that the United States created. What's further erased is that both of my parents come from indigenous backgrounds that have been erased because of the legacy of Spanish colonization. How is it that we, the descendants of people who have lived on this continent for millennia, are now illegal? It's no accident. It's the work of a system that upholds the interests and livelihoods of white people, of powerful white people, at the expense of everyone it deems as disposable. Intersectionality asks us to confront those forces of erasure, to see ourselves and others in the fullness of our beings. It asks us to be more critical of oppressions and to see the ways in which they are connected, and especially to see how living in white supremacy creates oppression. You may be asking yourself, what do I mean by white supremacy? Most of the time when this term is used, it conjures images of white hoods in the South, of a time in the past, in the backwaters of some rural community. When I say white supremacy, I'm referring to a system of implicit and explicit structures that communicate and uphold white superiority and dominance. I'm talking about advertising and media that's full of white faces and upholds whiteness as a standard of beauty. I'm talking about a system of professionalism that excludes non-white behaviors and dress. I'm talking about a criminal justice system that criminalizes and targets Black people for just existing. Racism is one of the ways that white supremacy shows itself, but I think it's important to tell the story of white supremacy to get into the depth of the force I'm talking about. And as just a side note, storytelling, the transmission of personal and community narratives is one of the ways we like to organize in RJ spaces. We're really big on verbal transmission, on storytelling, on really honoring the kinds of stories that are communicated and passed through people. So here's a story of white supremacy. As early settlers came to what would become the US from Europe, those in leadership were male and Christian. They did not identify as white. They identified with their ethnic, national, and or religious roots. They were English, French, Dutch. They were Protestant, Catholic, Puritan. They came with a desire to create a new world where they could profit and prosper. But once there, they faced a really big problem. The ruling class elite and their families were outnumbered by the indigenous people whose lives and land they were stealing, and the Africans who they forcibly kidnapped for enslavement and forced labor. Because the ruling class elite were outnumbered, they had to persuade newly arriving immigrants from Europe to cast aside their ethnic, national, and or religious differences into a solidarity that could meet the challenge they were facing. And so they created the category of white and whiteness and consolidated the idea of white supremacy as a way to organize these very different immigrants into a singular and unifying racial category. They did this by requiring them to disconnect from their ethnic and national identities in order to gain access to the material, emotional, physical, intellectual, and spiritual benefits of whiteness, designed specifically and intentionally to pit them against and place them above indigenous and enslaved peoples. The ruling class elite, or the power elite in the colonies of what was to become the United States, used the pseudoscientific concept of race to create whiteness and a hierarchy of racialized value in order to disconnect and divide white people from Black, Indigenous, and people of color, to disconnect and divide Black, Indigenous, and people of color from each other, to disconnect and divide white people from other white people, to disconnect and divide each and all of us from the earth, the sun, the wind, the water, the stars, and the animals that roam the earth. White supremacy trains us to internalize attitudes and behaviors that do not serve any of us. A belief that we can be perfect or should be perfect raises the questions: who decides what perfect is? Why would we want to be perfect? Worship of the written word is not in any way associated with the ability to write well. Worship of the written word is a cultural belief that something only has meaning if it is written down, and only if it is written down according to a very certain standard in a very certain way. This belief leads us to ignore and devalue all the wisdom that comes to us intuitively through our bodies, through story, through music, film, and song, through slang, through humor, through children's games, through prayer. We are strongest when we are allowed to be vulnerable with ourselves and with each other. White supremacy culture does not allow for vulnerability, and that's a tragedy for everybody. And that's why a huge part of reproductive justice is doing the cultural work and creating spaces where the vulnerability needed to resist white supremacy is celebrated. It looks like creating spaces where Black and people of color can be themselves without fear of being judged according to the standards of whiteness. It looks like bringing love and joy into this field that is so riddled with difficulties, barriers, and tragedies. It looks like being sex positive and resisting stigma that has us so afraid of our bodies and sexualities that people refuse to teach children comprehensive consent-based sex ed out of fear. The irony being that abstinence or stigma-based sex ed teaches children distorted, puritanical, heteronormative ideas about what sex is, what it means, and what it's for. It's no wonder that abstinence sex ed actually increases teen pregnancy rates. Reproductive justice advocates see the fear and scarcity white supremacy has us living under and show us alternate ways of living where we can support and hold each other through networks of care. At our last RJ convening, because Sister Song is a convener of people, it's a convener, it creates spaces where people can connect and have conversations and build that power. At our last convening, the Let's Talk About Sex conference, there were workshops about data privacy and period trackers, and workshops about twerking, because you can be a serious, hardworking professional and still want to have a good time. There was a workshop on abortion doulas where the person leading the workshop started the session by telling us how she had just been contacted by somebody to help get an abortion they needed to cross state lines for. She let us know that she was raising money. She put her Venmo up on the screen, and by the end of the session, she'd fundraised enough to get the person across state lines and to get them an abortion. We had a discussion with the cast of P-Valley. It's a show that follows the lives of employees of a strip club in Mississippi. We closed that day by putting a poll on the stage and inviting strippers from Dallas into the room to perform. We don't just talk our values, we live them. Reproductive justice is a movement created by Black women in the South advocating for the needs of their communities. We honor Black and Indigenous leadership, but the movement isn't just for Black and Indigenous people. It's for everyone who wants to build a world where we can live out the last tenet of reproductive justice, one that I think sums things up so well: the right to bodily autonomy free from all forms of reproductive oppression. It might sound like a dream to create this world, and in some ways it is. We're dealing with very real structures and very real limitations and very real barriers. There's a lot of work to be done in so many different spaces and in so many different ways. But that work really does start with a dream, with a belief that a different world is possible, that with the knowledge that we deserve so much more, with the understanding that we do have enough, and that we can be the people we need each other to be. So how do we do it? How do we start building a movement for reproductive justice? I put together this little list that I think is just a really good guidance for just how to live RJ. And starts with centering the most marginalized, understanding and implementing intersectionality, working to achieve human rights, working to dismantle white supremacy, and a focus on relationship building. The last point for me is the one that I really like to focus on the most. Our RJ organizing is only as strong as the relationships we build with each other, and the best relationships are built on trust, care, respect, and accountability. I'm getting to the end of my remarks, and I want to close with a video that illustrates the kind of work we do at Sister Song and the kinds of victories and organizing that are possible when you center the most marginalized in your work. So this is doesn't look like the PDF downloaded the video, unfortunately. But basically, I was going to show you all a video about a campaign we did in North Carolina. There were in North Carolina, incarcerated women who were pregnant were still being shackled, which is just incredibly cruel. It's a violation of human rights. Even if you're in jail, you should have a modicum of basic human dignity. And we organized in order to get a policy written that says that pregnant women are going to stop being shackled in jail. And that was possible through just building intense power, through people coming together, looking at these systems, calling them out and uniting to create change. I think that it's very difficult work. It's work that requires all of you, but it's also very rewarding work because of that. So on that note, I want to say thank you for your time and your attention today, for creating this space, and for welcoming me to tell you more about this incredible, incredible movement. I'm very excited to see what the rest of the day holds for us, and I just want to express gratitude to have been able to speak in front of you all today. Does anyone have any questions?
What kind of organizing did it take to get rid of the policy
Yeah, so that was a legislative victory. So it looked like political organizing. It looked like just basically talking about the issue, letting people know that it was a problem, and really foregrounding the humanity of people who were incarcerated. Like, one of the ways that the criminal justice system works and works really effectively is that it dehumanizes people. It makes us think that they deserve to be treated as less than, that they're horrible people, that they're stains on society. But when we look at the way the criminal justice system actually operates, it targets and persecutes people who are marginalized. It makes them really difficult for them to live their lives. And on top of that, when people go through the criminal justice system, they can't vote anymore when they get out. So that organizing looks like doing that work to get people to recognize that people in the criminal justice system are human, and that they deserve human rights.
First of all, stop? Yeah, there. Thank you so much for your comments and for giving us that framing and explaining it to us. Just so helpful. And I just wonder if you could say something about how do you approach people who are resistant to that framing but interested. I've run into people at times who are interested in talking about reproductive justice but seem reluctant to see any kind of structure or get down to the nitty-gritty. I'm wondering if you have any hints or tools that have worked for you to try to get them to engage on that level of, really creating some kind of structure and foundation to build on.
Yeah. I think one of the most useful things for me using the reproductive justice framework in my organizing is that it allows me to have conversations with people about reproductive justice that don't necessarily focus on abortion. I find that when the topic of abortion comes up, it is a topic that has been so stigmatized and has so much emotion attached to it that it makes a lot of people shut down, and it's just not emotionally it's not a useful way for people to access those thought patterns and to really start thinking about the implications that abortion access has. So for me, doing reproductive justice, I like letting people know that abortion is definitely at the center of our work. We recognize that abortion is so important for people being able to make decisions about their reproductive health. But other work that Sister Song does is also supporting mothers once they have children. One of the things we're doing in North Carolina is diaper drives. We literally get a bunch of diapers. When it was COVID, we had a drive-through diaper drive, and there were literally people who had just had babies who came through and got these supplies, and we just gave them out to people. There is no questions asked. We just let them know, if you have a child, come through, we'll give you these supplies. And I think that when you talk to people about reproductive justice and you say, hey, this is how we're supporting mothers. This is how we're supporting people actually raising families and actually, having healthy communities and actually being able to access reproductive care. That's not just abortion. When people can get down with that, people are like, okay, cool. Yeah, I like moms. I like that you're taking care of moms. And then, that's like a good way to segue into the conversation of and one of the other ways that we ensure that people can get the help, people can make the decisions about themselves that they need to make, is making sure that people can access abortion. Because I feel like once you foreground the humanity of somebody, you can have this conversation about abortion that's a little bit more complicated, because I think like the majority of women and people, because there are non-binary and male identifying people who have abortions, I think the majority of them actually already have children, and it is a sort of family planning decision. And there's a lot of instances of people having to get abortion care for pregnancies that don't develop properly, and foregrounding those conversations and really approaching it with this empathetic and empathetic view that really foregrounds care. I think people like that. People get down with that, and people are more open to that. Yeah.
Good morning. I have been on this campus for 70 years. As an obstetrician gynecologist, I've watched the evolution of this whole issue. For starters, I'm a little surprised not to see this place overflowing with people, because we have tons of intelligent young people around, and it's all of your issues. It's been some for me over the years. But I just thought I might share a little bit of the evolution. In 1950, Dr. Barnes was the head of OBGYN here. This is where I went to medical school. And as a medical student, I stood next to him as a young woman died from an abortion without revealing where she got it, hoping we were trying to protect another batch of women. And of course, there's so many reasons that people do not share these experiences. And then, of course, I went through the time when everybody had to get a psychiatric evaluation to prove that they would kill themselves if they did. And that really kind of worked for a while. It's too bad women had to do that to get what they wanted. And then, of course, we've gone on to all the other issues. And some of the basics, you look at, why are you having sex? Is it for pleasure, power? Many times it's a power thing between the sexes. Or is it for procreation? And with procreation, sometimes things turn out to be abnormalities that need to be. So we have a lot of reasons why we get there in the first place. I would have loved to have seen 50% of the people in this room be sperm donors. The sperm donors should be caring for their partners enough that they at least show up and try to find out some things about taking care of each other. And I've done a lot of work with young people in schools, and one of the things, and particularly the guys, I try to tell them to like their partner enough that they do take care of them. And I just came here today to see what was really going on, and to say that I'm disappointed in the audience at a place like this. And I really am. The Women's Center, which I was on the first committee to make that happen, we've been around a long time. And you all have the power, and it just seems to me with the resources and the research that we have, we can sure do a hell of a better job than we're doing. So obviously, I've been involved with this. I have a lot of interest in continuing to be involved. And I just hope that you all go out and beat the drums a little bit more, because in a way, it's sort of an embarrassment that we have such a small group here. there's work to be done. We know how to do it. So thanks for giving me a chance to chat.
Thank you. We are live streaming, so we do have a lot of people watching online, and this will be recorded in the future too.
Thank you so much for your presentation this morning. I wanted to ask you what you would ideally see from folks at Crew, folks in the audience, folks on live stream. How would you like to see folks engaging in reproductive justice in Cleveland?
Yeah, I think there's so many different ways to engage in reproductive justice. I think you can go to an abortion clinic and volunteer there and provide that kind of support. You can go to an abortion fund and also provide support. And you can also do small steps. Like, one of the things that makes abortion care and abortion access so difficult is the intense stigma that is built up around it. And combating that stigma, yeah, it looks like big, flashy campaigns and billboards and all that, but it also looks like just building networks of safety and support. You know, if you talk about abortion, if you let people know that it's like chill, that is, you know, not a big deal, you signal to others that it's safe to have conversations about those types of things. I think being that kind of advocate, even in a really small way, of providing that emotional support and care, is a really important place to start. And of course, there are all these different ways to plug into just abortion care work that is being done on the ground.
Thank you very much for being here today. This was a wonderful overview of this issue and so many great connections to explain how reproductive rights and white supremacy are connected. So thank you, first of all. I want to give a quick example. There's a local organization, a foundation here locally, the Gun Foundation. We think of philanthropies as generally conservative institutions. They've done a wonderful, they did a photo series of African-American women pregnant. And when I saw it, I realized how dominant the representation of motherhood in the United States is. If white people Google pregnancy, our algorithms only give us images of white pregnancy. And so I loved that they were able to disrupt that dominant trope, which is dangerous and deadly. And I wonder if you can tell us, the question I have is, at a moment when some of our conservative, our institutions even are beginning to embrace these what have been thought of as progressive ideas. Why do you think it's happening right now? Can you tell us a little bit about the political context right now? Why is this struggle flaming right now? And what can we do about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most fascinating thing about the kind of backlash we're seeing is that it's a global thing. It's not just here, you know, Bolsonaro in Brazil. Like, I think we're seeing the dying embers of a system in society that has fought tooth and nail to present itself as the only option. I think that's one of the reasons that all of our leaders are in their 70s right now. And I think that, you know, that is due to just the intensely technocratic operations of our government. Our government is really presented as like this free, impartial, accessible thing, but it's really not. Like, we look at the way that, you know, districts get, like, places get redistricted so that votes move a certain way. Like, you know, there's been this intentional strategy that's been happening to really ensure that the people who are representing us at the state house are not actually representative of the people in their communities. So I think part of what we're seeing is the endpoint of that. And what we can do is keep resisting, keep organizing, keep talking about it, keep building these networks of care and these communities of support. Because the thing about, you know, this moment is that I feel like a lot of people are afraid. And I know that with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, a lot of people were in a place of despair, and were really like, what's happening? All these rights are being walked back. We fought so hard. And yeah, we did fight really hard, but reproductive justice asks us to look at the gap between a policy as it's written, a law as it's written, and the actual implementation of that policy. Like for women of color in the South, Roe v. Wade was never really a thing. Like the abortion access has been so difficult that it was, basically it's like, does it matter that Roe v. Wade is law if we can't actually access the healthcare we need? So I think it's important to follow, Black and marginalized leadership at times like this, because they have already been doing the work outside of the protection of laws, outside of protection of the state, outside of having that state power, and Black people still exist. Black people still thrive. Black people still live. It's difficult. It's chaotic. It's so much more tragic than it needs to be. But I think by focusing on the people power we can build and the communities we can create and the ways we can take care of each other, we can start transforming systems in small ways and do it in different places at the same time and build a movement.